안녕하세요. 밴쿠버 인사이트입니다. 도널드 트럼프는 지난달 캐나다가 미국에 합병되어 51번째 주가 되어야 한다고 제안하면서 캐나다인들에게 충격을 주었습니다. 캐나다의 정치인들은 미국에 더 통합되거나 흡수되는 생각에 패닉 상태입니다. 하지만 평범한 캐나다인들은 어떨까요? 그들은 더 나은 거래에 열려 있을까요? 그리고 합병은 불가피할까요? 우리 경제는 트루도의 재앙적인 통치에서 회복될 수 있을까요? 이러한 정치적 환경에서 천연 자원을 개발하고 수출할 수 있을까요? 중국과 러시아와 같은 적대적인 국가가 북쪽을 노리는 불확실한 세상에서 캐나다는 살아남을 수 있을까요? 오늘은 저널리스트이며 칼럼니스트인 내셔널 포스트 편집자 다이안 프란시스를 소개해드리겠습니다. 그녀는 2013년 세기의 합병, 캐나다와 미국이 하나의 국가가 되어야 하는 이유의 책을 출간했습니다. 이 책은 사고 실험이었고 그것을 수행하는 다양한 방법을 살펴보았고 가장 이상적인 방법은 관세 동맹을 구축한 다음 통화 동맹을 구축하고 그 다음에는 완전한 경제 동맹을 구축하는 것입니다. 오늘날의 거래가 어떤 모습일지 그리고 트루도가 어떻게 캐나다를 완전히 파괴하여 합병이 그 어느 때보다 매력적으로 보이게 했는지에 대해 다이앤 이야기를 들어보겠습니다.
Yeah, I predicted everything that's happened because it was so obvious to me. I'm an American and a Canadian. I was born and raised in the U.S. I lived in Canada from the age of 19 on, did business, traveled, had relatives, and all that sort of thing between the two countries. The two cultures are different. There is no reason to think, they really are different, and then the French-Canadian culture is different again. And the political cultures are different. The political systems are different. The values are pretty much the same on the big questions. And I looked at polls back then, and it was pretty much in sync on issues like abortion, capital punishment, gun control, healthcare, public healthcare. Americans agreed, like Canadians, that this is what they aspired to having. And they don't have it, and we do. But the point is that they're very similar, but I could see that call it the Laurentian elite, but it's also a lot to do with Quebec, with Quebec and that sort of thing, is that the Canadian political system, is very weak, and it's run by people that are not that knowledgeable or, shall we say, sophisticated or international in mind. And so back then I said, you know what? Canada has no military. It can't guard its borders or its perimeters. Canada is completely and becoming more and more dependent on the United States economically and trade-wise and investment-wise. And, this was a problem. And Canada wasn't even able to pull off free trade within itself so that it could strengthen itself economically by doing business among one another. Instead, we were doing all this business north-south. So we were, melting slowly, merging slowly into the United States. So my thesis was, okay, well, that's fine. I don't think that's a problem, frankly, if that's what you want, but I don't think that's what Canadians would want. And I don't think that they would necessarily do well in a situation like that if the Americans were in charge, given how weakened we had made ourselves. So I talked about increasing the military. A country that can't protect its borders and perimeters really isn't even sovereign, and the Americans are doing it for us. And I said they were going to get tired of doing that. And bingo, here we are. So, we elect Trudeau, and he does everything to make it even worse. More dependency on the United States, no free trade deal coast to coast. We can't even get a pipeline to the East Coast from the West. All these kinds of things, these impediments, the overspending, the failure to take care of the border as well, and to provide our security, not just in terms of military, but to screen immigrants that enter our country. And of course, he's opened the floodgates in the last few years to immigrants, many unscreened because they come in as students, and they come as students to go to schools that don't exist. It's a lot of it's scam. And so we have about 2.5 million undocumented immigrants in Toronto and probably Vancouver and Toronto. That's where they go. And it's causing crime problems. It's causing all kinds of unsettling problems. It's jammed up the price of housing. It's overloaded our healthcare systems. It's been an unmitigated, the Trudeau 10 years is the lost decade. It's an unmitigated disaster. And then he also took aim at all the things I said we shouldn't. And that is, let's develop these resources. It's great. And Canada has a good environmental track record. We don't do bad things to the environment when we produce our metals and minerals and fossil fuels. And then let's do something about the Arctic. Otherwise, the Russians will claim it or the Americans will or whatever. Did nothing. And so now here we are. And so what do we do? So back then I said there were several merger models to look at. Canada, start to think ahead because you're not, either get strong and be independent or think about how you want to merge because that's what's going to have to happen. And the most, I think, palatable merger idea, there were many different models I had there. I had a lot of fun with it. In fact, I actually did a thought experiment with an investment banker relative, and we looked at the two countries as though they were corporations. We added up their natural resource assets and figured out how much it would cost the Americans to buy Canada. It was about $500,000 a person. $17 trillion. Canada is worth $17 trillion in resources, more than the United States. And it's bigger geographically as well. So the whole 51st state thing is very insulting and actually rooted in ignorance. So this is a long way of saying that I said, the economic union that the Europeans have done, that's been done to a certain extent in the Caribbean and among African countries, is a natural. That's what we should do. And then that way we have access to one another and we don't have to put up with their terrible healthcare system, their crime rate, their social unrest, and their gun laws. All the 5 models are very complicated, and I don't think they're that interesting. But I think the European Union model is a no-brainer. You keep your culture, you keep your legal system, you keep your political system, and you just get rid of customs. And then you get rid of, you adopt a single currency. Now, those are tricky things to do, and it's taken the Europeans a long time, and they pulled it off. The customs, having a customs union means you erase the border in terms of trade and investment. That's tricky. That's very tricky in terms of legalities and safety and all that sort of thing. But a customs union is doable. You don't completely erase the border. You don't let anybody walk across the border, for instance. But that would be, a customs union would be where I could take freight and have it arrive in Vancouver, and it could go anywhere in the US or Canada without crossing a border and it would cross the border, but it wouldn't be held up. It would be approved for continental purposes at any port of entry at the extremity. That would really speed up a lot of things and make everything more efficient. That actually has been worked on under free trade, moving toward that model. Monetary union's trickier. I mean, it'd be great if they paid us par if we got $1 US for $1 Canadian dollar, given how low ours is, but that's not going to happen. So that would be a negotiation of sorts. The West and East Germans did that. If you do a corporate type merger, which I looked at, it's a $17 trillion over contribution by Canadians to the merged entity, which was back then roughly $500,000 per person. And I said they'd actually have to also throw in healthcare for your grandchildren to get Canadians to want it. And I think there's something like 1 in 5 Americans have a Canadian grandparent. So, I mean, we have been the farm team talent-wise for the United States for a long time, which is another thing, of course, I mentioned in the book, which is another thing that we have to consider, that we will always be weaker than them because of the draw of that dynamic, more powerful world-class economy. Austria has the same problem. New Zealand has the same problem. So you get into some kind of formal arrangement where nobody's, impoverished or weakened to the point where they're, an overhead, a cost, and that sort of thing. The other thing, too, is that we could have repaired this a long time ago. And about 7 years ago, I wrote a column in the Post. I said, look, if we don't start to have a decent military and stop freeloading as a NATO member and as a member of NORAD, they're going to send us invoices. And they're going to be big invoices. And so they actually did, in fact, about 3 or 4 years ago. Quietly, the Defense Department and the Pentagon said to Canada, to the Trudeau government, here's $50 billion you have to spend on surveillance equipment in the Arctic. Get on with it. That was kept very quiet, never announced, of course, but that's padded into the overheads that Canadians are paying now. So, we can't freeload and we can't become too dependent. And, the brain drain will get worse unless we improve our own economy to keep people here or to attract Americans. Well, one of the ideas I had in the book 12 years ago was that we do a joint venture in the North with the Americans. They got the money, and build some, facilities for military and for rescue operations and that kind of thing, and just get on with it. But then, of course, we elected a guy who wanted to do photo ops with Greta Thunberg and made war against our natural resources, which is the underpinning for our entire lifestyle. And as they say, we know what he's done. He sabotaged natural resource. And that's the only thing that the North has to offer us is resources, is the extraction of metals, minerals, and fossil fuels. And we've got lots of it up there, but we can't even do it where it's in the South, where it's already been discovered and there's infrastructure to develop it. We've been impeded by that, by our government. So, we put ourselves in this box of being this tiny little, politically correct, wokey jokey, socialist, kingdom by the liberals. And you know what? It's not sustainable without American help.
미국의 혁명으로 캐나다는 반대에 의해 세워졌습니다. 그리고 캐나다인들은 대부분 대영제국으로 영국 왕관에 충성하고 싶었던 사람들인 충성파들로 구성되어 있었습니다. 하지만 그 제국은 오래전에 사라졌습니다. 이제는 캐나다인들은 충성심을 거의 느끼지 않습니다. 하지만 평범한 캐나다인들은 어떨까요? 그들은 같은 감정을 느낄까요? 대부분의 캐나다인들은 미국을 사랑한다고 생각합니다. 2,200만 명 이상의 캐나다인들이 매년 미국 방문으로 나라의 절반 이상이 비행기를 타거나 그들의 차를 타거나 해서 매년 미국에 갑니다. 수백만 캐나다인들이 살고 일을 하고 있습니다. 미국에서 풀타임 또는 파트타임으로 일을 하고 있습니다. 아마도 직업 허가만 받을 수 있다면 앞으로 더 많이 갈 것입니다. 더 많은 캐나다인 중 가장 재능 있는 배우들, 가수들, 유능한 사람들은 이미 미국으로 갔습니다. 최고의 법대생들, 최고의 기술 인력, 최고의 금융 인력인 그들은 모두 실리콘밸리나 뉴욕에 있습니다. 캐나다와 미국의 합병이 평범한 캐나다인들에게 이득이 될지 재앙이 될지, 정말로 트럼프는 합병을 할 계획이 있는지, 아니면 관세 전쟁으로 아주 싼 가격으로 많은 자원을 얻기 위해서인지, 여러분들은 어떻게 생각하시나요? 2013년에 사고실험으로 작성된 세계의 합병이라는 책이 있었다는 사실을 여러분들에게 알려드리고 싶었습니다. 오늘도 함께 해주셔서 감사합니다.